Pause. Don't scroll. Don't adjust your posture. Don't reach for the next distraction. Don't let your mind rush ahead to decide whether this is for you or not. Stay right here. There is a reason this moment interrupted you, and it has nothing to do with chance. Something inside you registered this before your thoughts had time to form an opinion. A subtle tightening in your chest. A quiet pull of attention. A sensation that didn't feel like curiosity, but like recognition. That reaction is not something you created. It happened to you. And that is important, because it tells you this message did not begin with your conscious choice. It began beneath it. You may think you arrived here accidentally, that you were simply scrolling, passing time, following patterns you followed 1,000 times before. But notice this. Most things you scroll past leave no imprint. They don't slow you. They don't ask anything of you. They don't ask you to stop. This did. And that interruption is the first signal that this moment is not random. Timing is not always loud. Divine orchestration does not always announce itself with spectacle. More often, it works through interruption, through a pause that doesn't make sense, through a hesitation that has no logical explanation, through a sense that something is asking to be received rather than evaluated. You didn't find this message. It surfaced at the exact moment you were capable of hearing it. That distinction matters. There were versions of you in the past who would not have stayed, versions of you who would have dismissed this, mocked it, or scrolled past without a second thought. But something has shifted. You are not who you were before, even if you can't fully explain how or when that change happened. The fact that you are still here, still reading, still listening, is evidence that a deeper layer of you is awake enough to recognize when something is speaking directly to it. This is not encouragement.
Encouragement tries to lift you from where you are to somewhere better. It assumes deficiency. It assumes lack. This is not that. This is revelation. Revelation does not push you forward. It pulls the veil back. It does not add something new to you. It reveals what has already been present but unrecognized. Nothing you are about to receive requires effort, motivation, discipline, or improvement. You are not being asked to become more. You are being asked to see clearly. Before you consciously agreed to listen, something in you already said yes. That is why this feels intimate instead of performative. That is why this does not feel like content, but like contact. You were involved before you consented, not because your will was bypassed, but because your spirit recognized something your mind had not yet named. This is how alignment works. The deeper self moves first. Thought follows later. If you're honest, this isn't the first time you've experienced this kind of knowing. There have been moments in your life where you sensed significance before you understood it, where you felt the weight of a moment before the facts arrived, where something inside you said, "Pay attention," long before you knew why. Those moments weren't coincidences either. They were markers, evidence that you have always been responsive to signals that don't come through logic alone. Right now, you are not being asked to do anything. Not to comment, not to affirm, not to commit, not to declare. Action is not the gateway here. Stillness is. Openness is. Presence is. You don't need to fix your posture or prepare your heart or clean up your thoughts. You don't need to believe harder or understand more. The only invitation is to stop resisting the pause, to let the moment be what it is without trying to control it. There is a difference between being distracted and being unavailable. You have been distracted many times in your life, but you have not always been unavailable.
Availability is quieter.
It is the willingness to be interrupted by something that does not fit neatly into your plans or expectations. And right now, you are available. That availability did not come from discipline. It came from experience. From living long enough, carrying enough, losing enough, enduring enough that surface-level noise no longer satisfies you the way it once did. This message meets you after fatigue, not before it. After disillusionment, not before it. After you've tried to explain yourself to the world and realized how limited language can be. After you have outgrown easy answers, but not lost your hunger for truth. That is why this doesn't feel like hype. It feels grounded. It feels quiet. It feels precise. It feels like something speaking to the part of you that has been listening for a long time without knowing what it was listening for. You don't need to convince yourself this matters. The fact that you haven't left yet tells you everything you need to know. Something in you understands that this moment is not about consumption, but recognition. Not about information, but remembrance. You are not being recruited. You are being addressed. And notice how this addressing does not flatter you or diminish you. It does not inflate your ego, nor does it shame you for where you are. It simply names a reality that has been present beneath the surface of your life. A reality you have felt but not articulated. A reality you have carried without validation. There is a reason your attention was stopped here and not elsewhere. There is a reason this did not arrive earlier or later. Timing is alignment between readiness and revelation. Too early and it sounds like noise. Too late and it sounds like regret. This moment is neither. It arrives when your defenses are tired enough to soften and your discernment is sharp enough to recognize substance. So stay still. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow without forcing it. Let the impulse to analyze, judge, or categorize rest for a moment. You don't need to decide what this means yet. Meaning will emerge on its own. For now, awareness is enough. This is not a message trying to get something from you. It is a message meeting you where you already are. You are not lost before this moment, and you are not suddenly found because of it. What is happening is simpler and deeper. Something true is being brought into your conscious awareness at the exact moment you are capable of holding it. You are not here by accident. You are not late. You are not early. You are precisely on time. And nothing is required of you except this. Remain open long enough for recognition to finish what it has already started. There is a kind of suffering that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't break down loudly or demand immediate attention, and you know it well. It is the suffering that happens in private, behind composed expressions and measured responses, in the quiet moments when you are finally alone and no longer required to perform strength for anyone else. You learned how to carry emotional weight without letting it spill, how to absorb pressure without transferring it, how to keep moving even when something inside you was asking to stop. From the outside, this looked like stability, competence, reliability. People saw you as strong, capable, unshaken. What they did not see was the effort it took to appear that way, or the cost you paid internally to maintain it. You smiled through storms, not because they didn't hurt, but because you understood that falling apart would create more problems than it solved. You showed up when you were depleted. You listened when you needed to be heard. You held space for others while quietly setting your own needs aside, telling yourself you would deal with them later. And because you continued to function, because you didn't visibly collapse, the world assumed you were fine. Your endurance was misread as ease. Your composure was mistaken for peace. The fact that you kept going became proof in other people's minds that nothing was wrong. But something was wrong. Or rather, something was heavy. You were doing emotional labor without language or recognition, regulating your reactions, managing tension, smoothing situations, preventing escalation,
carrying worry that wasn't always yours to carry. You became the stable point in unstable environments, the calm presence in charged spaces, the one who didn't add to the chaos. That role was never formally assigned, but it was implicitly expected, and over time, you internalized it. You became strong because someone had to be, and once you were strong, no one thought to ask what it was costing you to stay that way. There were moments when you longed to be seen without having to explain yourself. Moments when you wished someone would notice the fatigue behind your eyes, the restraint in your voice, the way you held yourself together by will alone. But asking for that recognition felt risky, maybe even pointless. You learned that it was safer to be self-contained, to process things on your own, to keep your inner world private. And so you did. You carried pain without witnesses, grief without ceremony, exhaustion without permission to rest. This kind of loneliness is particular. It is not the loneliness of being physically alone. It is the loneliness of being emotionally unaccompanied while surrounded by people. It is the isolation of being depended on but not supported, needed but not tended to. You were present for others in ways they were not present for you, and over time that imbalance became normalized. You didn't resent it, you adapted to it. But adaptation does not erase impact. It only delays acknowledgement. So let this be said clearly, without minimizing or reframing. What you went through was real. The pain counts even if no one validated it at the time. The labor mattered even if it was invisible.
The fact that you survived without collapsing does not mean you are unaffected. It means you are capable of enduring more than should have been asked of you alone. Strength does not negate suffering. Often it hides it. Naming this is not about reopening wounds or assigning blame. It is about accuracy, about allowing yourself to recognize that you were strong and that it cost you something, and that both truths can exist together without contradiction. You are not weak for feeling tired. You are not dramatic for needing support. You are not exaggerating the weight you carried. You were simply strong in a way that left you unseen. And now, finally, that unseen endurance is being acknowledged, not to glorify it, but to relieve you of the burden of carrying it without recognition. You no longer have to pretend that it didn't affect you. You no longer have to justify why you're tired, guarded, or careful. The loneliness of being strong without support is real, and naming it is not a failure of resilience. It is the beginning of being honest with yourself about what you lived through, and what you no longer need to carry alone. There is a truth that changes the meaning of everything you endured once you allow yourself to receive it. Nothing you carried went unnoticed. Not the tears you wiped away quickly so no one would ask questions. Not the prayers you whispered when you weren't even sure how to phrase what you needed. Not the sacrifices you made quietly, choosing what was right or necessary over what was easy or comforting. Even when there was no human witness, there was awareness. Even when there was no response you could see, there was attention. Your experience was not invisible simply because it was private. Human recognition is limited by proximity, perception, and capacity. People can only see what is expressed, only hear what is spoken, only value what resembles their own experience. God is not bound by those limits. God does not observe from the outside in, waiting for evidence or explanation. God sees from the inside out. Every internal decision, every moment of restraint, every time you chose patience, integrity, or compassion while no one was watching, was known in full context. Nothing had to be performed to be counted. Nothing had to be proven to be real. This reframes the loneliness you felt. What seemed like abandonment was not absence. What felt like silence was not indifference. There were seasons where you believed you were carrying everything alone, where the lack of external response made it seem as though your endurance was happening in a vacuum. But solitude and abandonment are not the same thing. Being unseen by people does not mean being unseen altogether. There is a difference between no one standing beside you and no one being aware of you. You may have lacked companionship, but you were never unobserved. This is where divine remembrance matters. In human systems, what isn't acknowledged often disappears. Effort without recognition fades. Pain without validation becomes easy to dismiss, even by the one who lived through it. But divine remembrance does not function like human memory. It does not forget with time or minimize with distance. What you endured was preserved not as a tally against you, but as testimony of who you are becoming. Nothing was lost simply because it was quiet. Every tear carried information, not just sorrow, but intention. Every prayer, spoken clearly or barely formed, was received in its essence, even when the words failed. Even the sacrifices you didn't label as sacrifices mattered. The times you held your tongue to protect peace, the times you chose responsibility over relief, the moments you stayed when leaving would have been easier. These were not neutral acts. They shaped you, and they were known as they were happening. This understanding changes the narrative of waste. You may have wondered if certain seasons were pointless, if the waiting was unnecessary, if the pain could have been avoided. But nothing endured in good faith is wasted. Nothing carried with sincerity disappears into nothingness. Preservation does not mean everything will be repaid in the way you expect or on the timeline you prefer, but it does mean that nothing meaningful evaporates. What was endured with honesty becomes part of a larger unfolding, even when the connection isn't immediately visible. Divine observation is not surveillance meant to judge. It is attention meant to hold. You are not being evaluated to see if you could endure more. You are being accompanied, even when you felt alone. The awareness itself is an act of care. To be fully seen is not always comforting in the moment, but it is stabilizing over time. It means your story is coherent, even when it felt fragmented. It means the quiet chapters still belong to the whole. And because nothing was ignored, nothing needs to be proven now. You do not have to justify your fatigue. You do not have to explain why certain things affected you so deeply. You do not have to minimize your own history to make others comfortable. The assurance that everything was seen allows you to stop carrying the additional burden of self-doubt about whether it counted. It did. All of it did. This is not about glorifying suffering or suggesting it was necessary in some abstract sense. It is about dignity, about knowing that your endurance was not random or forgotten, that your inner life mattered, even when it wasn't legible to others, that the love, restraint, and faith you practiced in isolation were real contributions, not invisible gestures. When you understand this, loneliness begins to loosen its grip. Not because the past suddenly feels easy, but because it no longer feels empty. The space where you once felt forgotten is recontextualized as a place where something was held, remembered, and preserved. You were not shouting into a void. You were speaking into presence. Nothing you endured was ignored. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was lost. And you are not late to understanding this. You are arriving exactly when you are ready to let it mean something different than it did before. What you have called resilience for most of your life was never simply a personal trait, never just grit or willpower or an unusually high tolerance for stress. That explanation has always been too small to account for what you survived. You tried to tell yourself you were just stubborn, just disciplined, just capable of pushing through. But there were moments when even that narrative broke down. Moments when you knew, quietly and without drama, that by all reasonable measures, you should not have had the strength you did. You were exhausted beyond motivation. You were past optimism. And yet, you were still standing, still choosing, still moving forward in ways that cannot be explained by personality alone. This is where the reframing begins. Your resilience was not self-generated. It did not originate solely from your psychology, your upbringing, or your coping skills. Those things mattered, but they were not the source. What sustained you came from beyond your own reserves. There was reinforcement arriving at the exact point where your own strength ended. Not as adrenaline, not as denial, but as a steadiness that didn't make sense given the circumstances. You were upheld, not hyped, carried, not rushed. There is a difference between forcing yourself to endure and being enabled to endure. Forced endurance hardens people. It leaves them brittle, angry, closed. Enabled endurance deepens people. It produces clarity, restraint, and a strange calm that coexists with pain. If you look honestly at yourself, you will notice that while you were marked by what you went through, you were not hollowed out by it. Something in you remained intact. Something stayed oriented toward truth, toward compassion, toward meaning. That preservation is not accidental. This is also why your intuition has never behaved like simple instinct or learned pattern recognition. You have always known things before you could justify them, felt shifts before they became visible, recognized danger, dishonesty, or opportunity without being able to explain how. You may have tried to rationalize this as sensitivity or overthinking, but deep down, you knew it was something else. It wasn't fear-based, it wasn't reactive. It was quiet, grounded, and persistent. It did not demand your attention, it waited for it. That is discernment, not suspicion, not anxiety. Discernment does not panic or rush to conclusions. It simply sees. It registers alignment and misalignment the way the body registers balance. You did not develop this by accident. It sharpened through experience, yes, but it was present before experience gave it language. And crucially, it was not given to make you superior to others. It was given to make you precise, to help you navigate complexity without losing yourself, to protect what needed protection, including your own integrity. Survival, then, is not the whole story. Many people survive by numbing, by shrinking, by closing off their inner world. You survived without disappearing. You adapted, but you did not abandon your core. You bent, but you did not break into something unrecognizable. That kind of survival points to reinforcement, not just resistance. It suggests that there was intention behind your preservation, not in the sense that pain was orchestrated for you, but in the sense that you were not left alone within it. There were interventions you did not notice at the time, delays that frustrated you but ultimately spared you, redirections that felt like loss but quietly protected you from harm you could not yet see, strength that arrived exactly when your own had run out. These moments rarely announce themselves as miracles. They feel ordinary while they are happening. It is only in retrospect that their pattern becomes visible. And when you see that pattern, it becomes difficult to maintain the belief that you were simply getting lucky. Endurance, in this light, stops being evidence of toughness and starts being evidence of calling. Not a calling to status or recognition, but a calling to capacity. You were built to hold more than average, not so you could be burdened endlessly, but so you could move through complexity without losing coherence. Your nervous system learned regulation under pressure. Your emotions learned depth without chaos. Your mind learned to wait for clarity instead of forcing certainty. These are not random outcomes. They are functional preparations. Calling does not mean constant struggle, and it does not mean perpetual sacrifice. That misunderstanding has caused enough harm already. Calling means there is alignment between who you are and what you are meant to carry, contribute, and protect. The evidence of calling is not how much you suffer. It is how you remain oriented toward truth, even when suffering would justify distortion. You did not become cruel. You did not become careless. You did not abandon meaning. That restraint is significant. You may have minimized this in yourself because it felt safer to call it luck or personality. Claiming divine sourcing can feel uncomfortable, even arrogant, especially if you have spent years staying small or avoiding attention. But acknowledging where your strength came from is not self-exaltation. It is accuracy. It is humility of a different kind. The humility of recognizing that you were helped, that you were sustained, that you were not the sole author of your endurance. This also releases you from the pressure to keep proving how strong you are. If your resilience came from a source beyond you, then you are not required to manufacture it endlessly. You are allowed to rest without fear of losing your worth. You are allowed to soften without becoming fragile. You are allowed to ask for support without invalidating your past strength. Calling does not demand constant output. It demands alignment, attentiveness, and honesty. Your discernment will continue to guide you, but it will do so differently now, less defensively, less urgently. It no longer needs to be hyper-vigilant, because you are no longer in a season where everything depends on your constant alertness. Discernment matures when it is trusted and not overused. It becomes quieter, cleaner, more efficient. You will notice that you no longer feel compelled to explain what you know. You simply act in accordance with it. Understanding your endurance as proof of calling also changes how you interpret the future. You are not bracing for the next collapse. You are not waiting for the moment when everything finally costs too much. That expectation belonged to a survival narrative that assumed you were alone. But if you were reinforced before, you will not suddenly be abandoned now. The same source that sustained you in constriction will meet you in expansion. This does not mean your life becomes easy. It means it becomes congruent. Resistance lessens, not because challenges disappear, but because you are no longer fighting against your own design. You are no longer using divine strength to survive human expectations that were never meant to define you. You begin to choose differently, slower, more intentionally, with less apology. Your resilience was never about proving you could endure pain. It was about demonstrating that you could carry responsibility without losing your soul, that you could remain open without being naive, that you could move through darkness without becoming it. These are not common capacities. They are not rewarded quickly or publicly, but they are deeply consequential. So let endurance be reinterpreted now, not as a demand placed on you, but as a testament to what has already been invested in you. You are not strong because you had to be. You are strong because you were sustained. And now that you can name the source, you no longer have to live as if it were solely up to you. You were reinforced for a reason, preserved with intention, guided by discernment, not fear. And whatever comes next will not require you to return to mere survival. You have already proven you can endure. The invitation now is to live from alignment rather than exhaustion, from calling rather than coping. There has been a kind of tiredness you've carried that never quite made sense. Not the kind that comes from long days or lack of sleep,
not the fatigue that resolves itself with a weekend of rest or a lighter schedule. This exhaustion lingered even when your body should have recovered. It showed up in quiet moments, in stillness, sometimes even after you had done nothing. And because you couldn't point to a clear physical cause, you may have questioned yourself, wondered if you were unmotivated, burned out, weak, or somehow failing to manage your life correctly. But this fatigue was not a malfunction. It was not a personal deficiency or a sign that something was wrong with you. It was the residue of ongoing spiritual activity. Work that did not require your conscious permission and did not announce itself as effort. You were expending energy in ways that do not register on conventional scales. And because our language is limited, we often try to force these experiences into medical or psychological categories that don't fully explain them. There is an important distinction that was never clearly offered to you. Physical rest and spiritual vigilance are not the same thing. Physical rest addresses the body, muscles, nervous system, sleep cycles. Spiritual vigilance operates on a different layer entirely.
It is the quiet attentiveness of someone who is constantly registering, sensing, holding, discerning. You may be lying down while still on duty internally. You may be asleep while something in you remains alert, responsive, engaged. This is why rest didn't always feel restorative. You could pause your schedule without truly disengaging. Your mind might slow, but your inner awareness stayed active. You were not relaxing because something deeper was still working, processing, guarding, interceding, stabilizing. This is not something you chose deliberately. It is something you were already doing long before you had words for it. Much of this activity occurred beyond conscious awareness. You were not waking up each day deciding to carry unseen weight or attend to invisible currents. It happened automatically, like breathing. You picked up emotional shifts in rooms. You absorbed tension others didn't notice. You sensed outcomes before they arrived and adjusted yourself accordingly. This kind of perception costs energy, even when it feels passive, especially when it feels passive. The body often becomes the messenger for work the mind cannot name. Fatigue is one of the few signals available when something has been exerting itself without recognition. And because no one around you validated this kind of labor, you likely turned the blame inward. You told yourself you should be more energized, more productive, more resilient. You compared yourself to people who seemed to move through life with less effort and wondered why it felt heavier for you. This is where shame quietly enters. Not dramatic shame, but a low-grade self-criticism that says, "I shouldn't be this tired," or "Others handle more than this." That voice did not come from truth. It came from misunderstanding. You were measuring yourself against standards that did not account for the kind of work you were doing or the depth at which you were operating. Normalizing this exhaustion is not about romanticizing suffering or avoiding practical care. It is about accuracy. When you understand that weariness can come from sustained inner vigilance, you stop pathologizing yourself. You stop assuming that fatigue always means something is broken. Sometimes it simply means something has been active for a long time without relief or acknowledgement. This understanding also releases you from self-blame. You are not lazy. You are not undisciplined. You are not failing to optimize your life. You were responding to demands that were not visible to others and barely visible to yourself. Of course you were tired. Of course your system needed gentleness. Of course, pushing harder only made things worse. There is a quiet permission that comes with naming this correctly. Permission to rest without justification. Permission to slow down without explanation. Permission to stop forcing yourself into rhythms that ignore your actual capacity. Spiritual vigilance does not end through effort. It softens through trust, through learning that you do not have to hold everything all the time. As this season shifts, you may notice that your fatigue begins to change as well. Not necessarily disappearing overnight, but losing its edge, becoming less heavy, less constant. That is because you are no longer being asked to maintain the same level of unseen alertness. The work is not gone, but the intensity is recalibrating. You are being allowed to come back into your body more fully, to inhabit rest instead of merely touching it. Let this be the moment where you stop apologizing to yourself for being tired. Let it be the moment where you stop trying to diagnose what was never an illness. Your weariness was information, not indictment. It was a signal that something meaningful was happening beneath the surface of your life, even when you could not name it. You are allowed to be gentle now. You are allowed to recover without guilt. You are allowed to trust that rest does not mean abandonment of purpose, and slowing down does not mean losing your place. The same awareness that sustained you through vigilance will guide you into restoration. Release the blame. Release the comparison. The Father Challenge is also close of the program and the Nothered Restoration. Release the program. This is a program that self. The program has work and never leave into it. Release the program is not police the weight. The stranger of state to program. Release the branger, of course the blame. Release the program, then not have a program. The breath, the program. The most evidence turn and a large that they were. Release the branger, his program. This is no world that little brace. And every important only. Release the branger, the justiful. Release the branger, his program. And another one forth never one's program and cern. Release the blameger, his program. Release the branger, release the blameger, his program. The people of management, the new moment composed to program. The managem heard is briefly release the blameger, which working the bunts into a dressed night. Release the blameger, he's crashed. Release the blameger, his working the new moment into program. The blame as briefly trends a temperature of the dressed managems. Release the blameger, his higher. Release the blameger, his working the new moment into program. Release the blameger, his fair. But everything that it isn't power in yourself, the new moment to leave your people degree. The blame as allowed to challenge into free terment, which will be believed to help your videos. The blameger opposed one managems, which the managem is, the managems, which for blave. The blameger opposed vertively loud. The managem also worked in if the new moments exist in your place. The blame as allowed to challenge does not mean vigilance, through vigilance into restoration. Release the blame. Release the comparison. Release the demand to be endlessly functional. Your exhaustion was never a failure. It was evidence of sustained inner activity. And now, finally, you are permitted to rest without shame. There has always been a pattern in your life that you struggled to explain, even to yourself. Moments when you knew something before you had any evidence. Times when your body reacted before your mind could form a thought. You sensed a shift, a change, a truth. And only later did circumstances catch up to confirm what you already felt. This wasn't guesswork. It wasn't imagination. It was a kind of knowing that arrived fully formed, without a clear trail of logic behind it. You read people intuitively, not in a judgmental way, not by scanning their words or analyzing their behavior, but by feeling them. You noticed inconsistencies in energy before inconsistencies appeared in action. You could walk into a room and feel tension, openness, hostility, or grief without anyone saying a word. Conversations carried subtext you picked up immediately. Emotional undercurrents announced themselves to you long before they surfaced for others. This ability often activated early in your life. As a child, you may have sensed when adults weren't safe, even if they smiled. You may have felt when something was off before anything visibly went wrong. You learned to trust your stomach, your chest, the quiet tightening or softening inside you. You didn't have language for it then, and you probably weren't encouraged to honor it. In fact, you may have been told you were overreacting, too sensitive, dramatic, or suspicious. That misunderstanding created confusion. Because when you are repeatedly told your perception is inaccurate, you start to doubt your internal signals. You begin to wonder whether your awareness is actually anxiety, whether your sensitivity is actually paranoia, whether your foresight is simply fear dressed up as intuition. This is especially true if you have lived through betrayal or instability, because the line between perception and hypervigilance can feel thin. But there is a crucial difference, and you have lived on both sides of it. Paranoia is loud, it spirals, it feeds on imagined futures and rarely settles. It demands constant reassurance and multiplies possibilities until everything feels threatening. True perception, on the other hand, is quiet. It arrives without panic. It does not argue or insist. It simply presents itself and waits. Your knowing did not come with hysteria. It came with clarity, sometimes even with calm. You didn't always want to be right, and often you hoped you were wrong. But the knowing stayed, steady and unchanging, regardless of your preference. And when events unfolded, they did so in alignment with what you had already sensed. That pattern repeated enough times that it left an imprint on you. You learned that your awareness detects misalignment early. You sense when words and intentions don't match, when someone is masking resentment behind kindness, when an environment is no longer safe for your growth. You feel danger not as fear, but as contraction. You feel deception not as suspicion, but as dissonance. You feel misalignment not as judgment, but as heaviness. This sensitivity is not something you acquired accidentally. It is not the result of trauma alone, though trauma may have sharpened it. It is not a flaw you need to correct or blunt. It is a design feature. You were built to notice subtle shifts, to register information that lives beneath the obvious. While others rely primarily on external data, you receive internal signals that complement what can be seen.
Because this ability operates quietly, it often goes unrecognized. You don't announce it. You don't always act on it immediately. Sometimes you hold it inside, waiting for confirmation you don't actually need. That holding costs energy. That restraint costs clarity. And when your knowing is repeatedly dismissed by others, it can begin to feel like a burden rather than a gift. But here is the truth. Your sensitivity has protected you more times than you can count. It has redirected you away from people who would have harmed you further. It has alerted you to danger early enough to minimize damage. It has helped you read situations accurately when logic alone would have failed. Even when you ignored it, it did not abandon you. It waited. Affirming this part of you does not mean acting impulsively or assuming you are infallible. It means honoring the difference between fear-based imagination and grounded perception. It means learning to listen without dramatizing, to trust without rushing. It means understanding that your inner signals are not trying to control you. They are trying to inform you. You were never too much. You were attuned. You were never broken. You were receptive. The world is not built to accommodate people who sense deeply, so it often labels them incorrectly. But that does not negate the function you serve. You notice what others miss. You feel what others suppress. You know when something has shifted before it becomes undeniable. As you grow into trust with this part of yourself, the confusion eases. You stop arguing with your own perception. You stop gaslighting yourself. You stop apologizing for knowing what you know. And in that clarity, your sensitivity becomes less exhausting, less overwhelming, because you are no longer fighting it. This awareness was never meant to isolate you. It was meant to guide you. And when you recognize it as design rather than defect, you begin to move through the world with a quieter confidence. Not louder, not more defensive, just more aligned. You don't need to become less sensitive to be safe. You need to become more honest with what you perceive. Your knowing has always been there for a reason, and now you are allowed to trust it without fear. There is a role you have been living inside of without ever being formally introduced to it. Not assigned with ceremony, not explained with language, not clarified in a way that made it easy to understand. You simply found yourself feeling things that did not originate in your own story, carrying weight that did not match your circumstances, responding emotionally to situations you were not directly involved in. And because there was no visible cause, you assumed the source must be you. But there is another explanation, one that does not require you to be broken, overly sensitive, or unstable. You have been functioning as an intermediary, a bridge, a stabilizing presence between inner worlds and outer realities. Not in a dramatic or performative way, but in a quiet, unseen, deeply internal one. You have noticed it in the way emotions arrive without invitation, a sudden heaviness when nothing in your life is going wrong, a wave of grief that doesn't belong to your memories, anxiety that flares even when you are safe, a sense of urgency with no clear task attached to it. These experiences did not come from your personal timeline. They came through you, not from you. This is what it means to carry emotional burdens that originate outside your own circumstances. You were not just processing your own experiences. You were registering the emotional field around you, people, environments, relationships, even future outcomes that had not yet unfolded. Your system picked up signals others were unaware of, and because you were receptive, they landed in you. This kind of receptivity often begins early, long before adulthood, long before you had choice or consent.
As a child, you may have felt responsible for emotional harmony in your family without knowing why. You sensed tension before arguments started. You absorbed unspoken grief. You adjusted yourself to stabilize the atmosphere. You learned to hold things together quietly, intuitively, without instruction. That pattern didn't stop. It matured. As you grew, you continued to carry pain linked to other people's lives. You worried deeply for friends without knowing the full story. You felt sorrow for strangers. You carried dread or hope that didn't belong to your immediate reality. Sometimes you couldn't explain why you felt burdened, only that you did. And when you tried to trace it back, there was nothing in your own life that justified the intensity. This is the experience of someone who intercedes without recognition or explanation. You were responding to needs before they were named, holding emotional space before anyone asked you to, processing outcomes before they occurred. And because this happened internally, there was no acknowledgement, no validation, no relief that comes from being seen or thanked. You were simply the strong one, the calm one, the one people leaned on, the one who could handle it. But the truth is, you were often being used as a shield without being informed. You absorbed impact so others wouldn't have to. You softened emotional blows before they reached people you cared about. You carried tension so situations wouldn't collapse. You felt pain in advance so others could encounter it later in diluted form. This was not a conscious contract you signed. You were not told, "This is your role." You were not asked if you agreed. It happened because your system was capable of it, because you could hold complexity without shattering, because you could feel deeply without becoming cruel or closed. That capacity made you useful in ways you never fully understood. And because you weren't informed, you blamed yourself for the cost.
You wondered why you felt heavier than others, why you needed more solitude, why rest didn't always restore you, why emotional waves came and went without explanation. You may have tried to fix yourself, numb yourself, distract yourself, or intellectualize what was happening. You may have thought you were too empathetic, too porous, too affected by things that weren't your problem. But they were never your problem in the way you assumed. They were your assignment in a much quieter sense, not as a burden to suffer endlessly, but as a function you were performing without context. This does not mean you were meant to be depleted. It does not mean your pain was required or deserved. It means you were operating without boundaries you were never taught to build. You were giving without knowing you were giving, holding without knowing you were holding, standing in spaces where pressure passed through you instead of landing elsewhere. That kind of invisible labor changes a person. It creates fatigue that cannot be explained by workload. It creates loneliness that cannot be resolved by company. Because how do you explain pain that isn't yours? Grief that has no story, responsibility that was never named. Often, you didn't. You stayed quiet. You normalized it. You told yourself this was just how you were. You learned to function while carrying weight no one else could see. And because you didn't collapse, people assumed you were fine. But being able to carry something does not mean you were meant to carry it forever. There comes a point when intermediaries must be made aware of their role, not to inflate them, not to isolate them, but to free them from unconscious overextension. Awareness changes everything. Once you know that not all emotional input belongs to you, you can begin to release what was never meant to stay. You can stop identifying with pain that simply passed through you. You were never meant to be a permanent container for other people's unresolved lives.
You were never meant to hold futures that were not yours to fulfill. You were never meant to suffer in silence without explanation. The lack of explanation was not a test of your worth. It was a gap in understanding. Now that understanding is arriving, you are allowed to differentiate, to ask, "Is this mine?" To set down weight that does not belong to your path, to step out of the role of silent absorber and into one of conscious presence. Intermediaries do not lose their sensitivity when they gain awareness. They gain choice. And choice restores energy. You can still care without carrying. You can still perceive without absorbing. You can still stand in compassion without being used as a shield. This is not abandonment of purpose. It is refinement of it. A movement from unconscious sacrifice to conscious alignment. Nothing you carried was meaningless. Nothing you felt was imaginary. But not everything you held was meant to define you. You were never broken for feeling too much. You were simply positioned too quietly for too long. And now, as clarity replaces confusion, you are allowed to step back into yourself, not as a dumping ground for unseen burdens, but as a whole person who can finally distinguish where they end and the world begins. That distinction is not loss, it is relief. And for the first time, you can begin to feel lighter, not because you care less, but because you are no longer carrying what was never meant to stay. There has always been a quiet question following you through your life, even when you didn't give it words. Why does it feel harder for me than for others? Not in a self-pitying way, not as a complaint, but as a genuine confusion. You watched people move forward with fewer obstacles, recover more quickly, collapse and still be rescued. Meanwhile, your path seemed to demand endurance at a level that felt disproportionate to what you were given, what you asked for, or what you thought you could handle. This wasn't imagination, and it wasn't punishment. Resistance shows up most intensely where impact would be greatest if something were left unguarded. Pressure does not scatter randomly, it concentrates. In systems, both natural and spiritual, force is applied where structure matters most. Weak points are tested, yes, but so are load-bearing ones. You were not facing resistance because you were fragile. You were facing it because you were consequential. The hardship you encountered was rarely subtle. It wasn't a single storm that passed and taught a clean lesson. It was accumulation, relentless opposition, setbacks layered on top of unresolved strain, moments where relief almost arrived only to be delayed again. This kind of pressure wears a person down not through intensity alone, but through duration. And yet, you stayed. That persistence wasn't stubbornness, it wasn't blind hope. It was something deeper, a refusal that didn't feel optional. You may have told yourself many times that you were close to giving up. You may have fantasized about disappearing, quitting, choosing an easier life, becoming smaller. But when the moment came where surrender would have been final, something intervened. Not dramatically, not always with comfort. Sometimes it was just enough clarity to take the next breath, enough grounding to get through the next hour, enough sense of responsibility to stay. This is where the explanation begins to take shape. You were positioned as a point of protection for others long before you understood it. Not necessarily in visible ways, not always as a leader or caretaker. Sometimes simply by remaining present, stable, conscious. Your existence alone created a buffer. Your awareness prevented collapse from spreading. Your endurance absorbed shockwaves that might have shattered people around you. This is why the pressure felt out of proportion to your personal circumstances. You weren't just navigating your own life. You were holding a line.
And lines that hold are targeted precisely because of what would happen if they broke. Survival, in your case, was never random. It wasn't luck. It wasn't just grit. It was strategic preservation. There were moments when logic said you shouldn't have made it through. Times when the emotional toll exceeded what most nervous systems can integrate. Periods when repeated loss, betrayal, or isolation should have pushed you into collapse or numbness. And yet, you remained intact in a way that surprised even you. Changed, yes. Scarred, yes. But not erased. That survival mattered beyond you. If you had exited certain seasons early, if you had truly given up, shut down, or disappeared, there would have been consequences you never saw. Connections that would have unraveled, timelines that would have shifted, people who would have faced what you intercepted without any buffer at all. You weren't meant to know this in detail because knowing would have added weight you didn't need. But the structure of your life reveals it in hindsight. You endured because something depended on your endurance. This doesn't mean your suffering was required in a cruel sense. It means your capacity was recognized before your comfort was prioritized. That is not favoritism. It is responsibility. The same reason certain materials are used in critical structures and others are not. Not because they deserve more stress, but because they can hold it without failing. And still, you were allowed to feel the cost. You felt the loneliness of being strong when you didn't want to be, the frustration of being capable when you were exhausted, the grief of realizing that others could step away from things you had to stay inside, the anger that surfaced when you realized how little acknowledgement came with so much resistance. Those feelings were valid. They didn't disqualify you. They didn't weaken your role.
They humanized it.
The reason giving up was never truly an option is not because you lacked imagination or courage to choose differently. It's because something in you understood, even without words, that leaving would fracture more than just your own life. There was an internal no that rose whenever the thought of total withdrawal appeared. Not loud, not dramatic, just firm. You couldn't abandon yourself because you weren't only carrying yourself. And now, this understanding reframes everything. The resistance wasn't a sign you were off path. It was confirmation that your presence mattered. The pressure wasn't meant to crush you. It was meant to test and reinforce your structural integrity. The survival wasn't just recovery. It was preservation for future alignment. This does not mean the pressure will continue indefinitely. Strategic preservation does not require perpetual strain. Once the structure is secure, the force redistributes. Once the critical phase passes, the load lightens. You are not meant to live forever in crisis mode, but you are meant to recognize that you were never weak for struggling. You were never dramatic for feeling overwhelmed. You were never wrong for wondering why it was so hard. It was hard because it mattered. And it mattered because you mattered in ways that extended beyond your awareness at the time. Now, as the resistance shifts, so does your role. You are no longer only holding, you are beginning to live. The strength that once functioned as defense can become clarity. The endurance that once kept you upright can become direction. The survival that once felt like bare minimum can now support something more intentional. You didn't endure all of that just to stay alive. You endured because staying was necessary, until it wasn't. And now, the same force that kept you from giving up is making room for something else. Relief without collapse, purpose without pressure, impact without constant resistance. Giving up was never truly an option because you were never only fighting for yourself. And now that the heaviest phase has passed, you're finally allowed to discover what life feels like when survival is no longer the primary task, but the foundation already built beneath you. What you endured was never meant to hollow you out. It wasn't sent to erase you, harden you, or leave you smaller than before. It felt like that at times, like something was actively dismantling your sense of safety, trust, and continuity. But what was actually happening ran in the opposite direction. Pain in your life functioned less like a wrecking force and more like a refining one. It stripped away what couldn't hold weight without touching the core that could. Refinement is not gentle. It doesn't announce itself as growth. It feels like pressure, exposure, and loss of familiar structure. Destruction leaves nothing usable behind. Refinement leaves fewer things, but stronger ones. What survived in you was not accidental. It was what could carry truth without distortion. Betrayal is one of the clearest examples of this. Betrayal usually teaches people to close, to armor, to assume the worst and retreat behind suspicion. But something different happened in you. Yes, it hurt, deeply. It rearranged your understanding of people and safety. But instead of calcifying your heart, it sharpened your perception. You didn't stop caring, you stopped being naive. You learned how to sense incongruence, how to feel when words and intent don't align, how to recognize subtle shifts in energy, tone, timing. The trail trained your discernment without killing your capacity for connection. That balance is rare. Most people swing to one extreme or the other, open and unguarded, or protected and closed. You learned how to remain open and aware. That is not bitterness. That is maturity earned through cost. Loss worked on you in a similar way. Loss often creates either clinging or numbness. People either grasp tighter at what remains or shut down entirely to avoid further pain. But again, you moved through a different transformation. Loss taught you detachment, not indifference, but clarity. You learned how to let go without dissociating, how to grieve without erasing your ability to feel joy later, how to release without abandoning your emotional life. Detachment in this sense is not coldness, it's freedom from illusion. You stopped demanding permanence from what was never meant to stay. You stopped tying your identity to things that could be taken from you. And yet, you didn't stop loving. You didn't stop investing meaning. You simply stopped confusing love with control and presence with possession. That shift changed the texture of your inner world. You became deeper, not heavier, quieter, but not empty, more selective, but not isolated. The wisdom that formed wasn't intellectual, it was embodied. You didn't learn lessons in neat, conscious ways. Most of your growth happened below the surface, while you were just trying to survive, breathe, and make it through the day. That matters, because some of the most profound transformations don't come with awareness. They happen while the mind is occupied with endurance, while you're functioning on autopilot, while you think nothing meaningful is happening except pain. But underneath, something is integrating. Your nervous system is recalibrating. Your values are clarifying. Your perception is reorganizing around truth rather than fantasy. Suffering, in your case, did not make you wiser because you analyzed it. It made you wiser because you stayed present inside it. You didn't escape into denial. You didn't numb out permanently. You didn't turn your pain into an identity. You let it move through you, even when you didn't know that's what you were doing. That is transmutation. Pain entered as raw experience, confusing, overwhelming, unwanted. Over time, it changed form. It became insight. It became patience. It became an ability to sit with complexity without needing immediate resolution. It became compassion that doesn't collapse into self-sacrifice. It became depth that doesn't perform or explain itself. You can hear it now in how you speak, in how you listen, in how you pause before reacting, in how you recognize patterns others miss. That didn't come from comfort. It came from lived pressure that refined your inner structure. And the most important part, none of this required you to be conscious of it at the time. Growth does not need awareness to occur. Seeds don't know they are becoming trees. Muscles don't understand adaptation while they are tearing and repairing. You didn't fail because you weren't spiritually aware enough during your hardest seasons. You were already doing the work, simply by remaining alive, responsive, and human. Nothing you suffered was wasted, not because suffering is good, but because you were capable of transforming it. The depth you carry now is not heaviness, it is capacity. The wisdom you hold is not detachment from life, it is intimacy with reality. You were refined, not ruined. And now, what remains in you is not a scarred version of who you were, it is a truer one.